I hadn't slept through the night in almost a year. Not really slept, not the kind of sleep that leaves you rested, that lets your body forget it belongs to someone else for a few hours. My son was 11 months old, and I loved him with a ferocity that sometimes frightened me, a love so total it had quietly eaten every other part of my life without asking permission. I used to be someone who read novels on Sunday mornings with coffee going cold beside me. I used to run. I used to have opinions about restaurants. Now, I measured my days in feedings and diaper changes and the particular quality of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you haven't had 8 consecutive hours of rest in 300 and some days. I stopped counting after a while. Counting made it worse. Ethan worked. That was the sentence he offered whenever I asked for anything, as if it were a complete argument, as if the 2 words closed every door I tried to open. He left at 7 and came home at 6:30, and in between those hours I was alone with a baby who cried when he was hungry and cried when he was tired and cried, some nights, for reasons no manual could explain. I loved being his mother. I want to say that clearly, because everything that follows might sound like I didn't, and that isn't true. I loved him so much it terrified me. But loving someone completely doesn't mean you stop needing anything for yourself. Nobody tells you that before you become a mother. Nobody tells you that the exhaustion isn't just physical, that it hollows out a place inside you where your own name used to live. One evening, after a day that had been particularly relentless, a day where the baby had refused every nap, where I had eaten standing at the counter, because sitting down felt like a luxury I hadn't earned, I asked Ethan if he could take our son for just 1 hour on Saturday morning. 1 hour. I wanted to take a bath without listening for a cry through the wall. I wanted to sit somewhere quiet and not be needed by anyone, even for 60 minutes. It felt like such a small thing to ask. I had rehearsed how I would say it, tried to make my voice light so it wouldn't sound like the accusation it secretly was. He looked at me, and he laughed. Not cruelly, exactly, that was the strange part, that it wasn't delivered with malice, just with the easy dismissiveness of someone who has never once considered that his wife might be drowning quietly in the next room. "Where would you even go?" he said, like the question itself was the joke. Like the idea that I might need somewhere to go, some hour that belonged only to me, was so absurd it answered itself. I didn't say anything. I remember standing there in the kitchen with a dish towel in my hand, and something in me went very still and very cold, the way water goes still right before it freezes. That wasn't the only time. It became a kind of refrain in our house. Whenever I asked for help, whenever I said I was tired, whenever I tried to explain that raising a child alone for 12 hours a day while he was at an office with adult conversation and lunch breaks and silence was its own kind of labor, he would say the same thing. "I work all day." As if I didn't. As if what I did wasn't work because no one paid me for it, because it didn't come with a title or a desk or colleagues who nodded when I walked past. I cooked every meal. I cleaned every room. I did the laundry, folded the tiny socks, sterilized the bottles, learned the specific cry that meant teething and the one that meant a wet diaper and the one that meant he just wanted to be held. I did all of it while running on fragments of sleep, and when I asked for 1 hour, 1 single hour, I was met with a joke about where I would even go. During one of our arguments, and by then they had started to feel less like arguments and more like the same fight wearing different clothes, I told him I couldn't keep doing this alone. I told him I felt like I was disappearing. He didn't apologize, he didn't even really engage with what I'd said. He just looked at me with something between irritation and boredom and said, "You have nowhere to go." Not cruelly shouted, not meant, I think, as a threat exactly. Just stated, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. A door closing so quietly you almost didn't hear the latch. I want to tell you what that sentence did to something in me. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't cry, didn't slam anything, didn't storm out. I just went to check on the baby, and I stood over his crib in the dark listening to him breathe, and I thought, he's right. I have nowhere to go. My name wasn't on the lease of anywhere else. My savings, what little existed, were tied to an account we shared, an account he checked more than I did. My friends had drifted since the baby came, the way friendships do when you stop having the energy to maintain them. My own mother lived 4 states away and had her own life, her own limits on how long she could host a daughter and a grandson. He wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. He wasn't wrong, and he knew it, and some small, ugly part of him found comfort in being right. 2 weeks later, I packed everything. I need to back up, because that sentence makes it sound like I simply woke up one morning with resolve I hadn't had before, and that isn't quite how it happened. What happened was a phone call, on a Tuesday afternoon while the baby napped for once, an actual nap, 40 whole minutes of quiet. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a notary, and for a moment I thought it was a scam, one of those calls you're supposed to hang up on. But he said a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, my great Aunt Alina, and something in my chest tightened before he even finished the sentence. Alina wasn't someone I saw often. She lived 2 hours away, in a small house on the edge of a town I'd visited maybe half a dozen times in my adult life, always for holidays that felt more obligatory than warm. I remembered her as a quiet woman with flour permanently dusted into the creases of her hands, someone who spoke rarely but noticed everything. When I was a teenager, she once told me, apropos of nothing, that I had a restless kind of kindness, the sort that gives too much and forgets to save any for itself. I hadn't thought about that sentence in over a decade, but it came back to me whole and unbidden as the notary explained, gently, that she had passed away the week before. Peacefully, in her sleep, he said, as though that detail might soften something. I hadn't even known she was ill. We had exchanged Christmas cards and little else for years, the kind of relationship that exists more in memory than in practice, and now she was gone, and somehow, impossibly, she had left something for me. The house, he said, the small plot of land it sat on. Her savings, modest but not nothing, all of it to me. I sat on the edge of the bathtub with the phone pressed to my ear and my son's monitor crackling faintly from the other room, and I didn't understand, not fully, not yet, what was happening. I asked if there had been a mistake. He assured me there hadn't. He said there was also a letter, that she had left specific instructions, it be given to me personally, unopened, and that I could come by the office whenever I was ready. I went 2 days later, driving with the baby asleep in his car seat, my hands tight on the wheel the entire way as if the letter might disappear if I didn't get there fast enough. The notary's office smelled like old paper and coffee. He handed me an envelope with my name written on it in handwriting I recognized instantly, careful, slightly slanted, the handwriting of someone who had learned cursive in a stricter era and never let it go. I didn't open it there. I waited until I was back in the car, engine off, my son still sleeping, the afternoon light slanting gold through the windshield. Inside was a single page. Alina had never been a woman of many words, and she wasn't one now. She wrote that she had watched from a distance, more of a distance than she wished. She admitted, and that she recognized something in me she had once recognized in herself, a long time ago, before she'd learned to stop asking for what she needed. She wrote about her own marriage, briefly, a marriage I hadn't known much about, ended decades before I was born, and how the house had been the first thing that was ever entirely hers. She wrote that she wanted me to have a place that was entirely mine too, not because she thought I needed rescuing, but because she believed every woman deserved somewhere she could exhale. The last line was the one I read over and over, until the ink practically burned itself into the back of my eyes. Every woman deserves a place where she feels safe. I sat in that parked car for a long time. I thought about the kitchen, the dish towel, the laugh, the question that wasn't really a question. Where would you even go? You have nowhere to go. I thought about how certain he had sounded saying it, how certain I had felt hearing it, how completely I had believed, for months, that it was simply true. And now, folded in my lap, was proof that it never had been. I had somewhere. I had somewhere with a roof and a door that would lock behind me and no one on the other side of it who would laugh at what I needed. I didn't decide everything in that moment, not the divorce, not the move, not any of it in its final shape. But something shifted, the way ice shifts before it finally cracks quietly at first, and then all at once. I drove home with my son still sleeping in the back. And that night, after Ethan had gone to bed without asking how my day had been, without asking about the phone call I'd mentioned only briefly at dinner, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started making a list. Not of grievances. I didn't need to write those down, I could have recited them in my sleep if I'd ever gotten enough sleep to dream. I made a list of what I needed to do. Practical things, bank accounts, a lawyer, boxes. 2 weeks later I packed everything. It didn't take as long as I expected, mostly because I owned less than I thought. Years of putting everyone else first meant there wasn't much that was purely mine to gather. Clothes, a box of photographs, my son's favorite blanket, the one with the frayed corner he liked to hold against his cheek. I packed while Ethan was at work, not out of cowardice, I told myself, but because I couldn't bear another conversation that ended with him explaining, patiently, like I was a child, why my feelings weren't reasonable. I left a note. I don't remember every word of it now, only that it was shorter than I expected it to be, and that I didn't apologize in it, which surprised me, because apologizing had become such a reflex in that house that I'd almost forgot I was allowed to leave a room without one. The drive to Alina's house, my house, I had to keep correcting myself, took 2 hours, and I spent most of it in a strange, suspended calm, the kind that comes after a decision has finally been made and there's nothing left to do but follow through on it. My son slept for most of the drive. When he woke, somewhere past the halfway point, he didn't cry. He just looked out the window at fields I didn't recognize, and I found myself talking to him the way I used to before exhaustion flattened my voice into something functional and joyless. I told him we were going somewhere new. I told him it was going to be good. I wasn't entirely sure I believed it yet, but saying it out loud helped. The house was smaller than I remembered, and also somehow larger, the way places from childhood always recalibrate themselves against adult memory. It smelled like dust, and something sweeter underneath, cinnamon maybe, ghosted into the walls from decades of Alina's baking. I stood in the doorway with my son on my hip and felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could measure, not happiness exactly, not yet, but the absence of dread. No one was going to laugh at me here. No one was going to tell me I had nowhere to go because I was already there. The divorce took months, the way these things do, all paperwork and waiting rooms and a lawyer who spoke to me with more patience than my husband ever had. Ethan was angry at first, in the particular way people are angry when they've never had to consider that the people who serve them might one day stop. He called several times in the beginning, his voice moving between fury and a kind of bewildered hurt that almost made me doubt myself, until I remembered the dish towel in my hand and the laugh and the question that wasn't a question. He came around, eventually, enough to co-parent without making every exchange a battlefield, though eventually took longer than I would have liked and required more patience than I thought I had left. I gave what I could. I didn't give what I couldn't anymore. I won't pretend the first months in the house were easy. Grief has strange timing. I mourned my marriage in bursts, usually late at night after my son was finally asleep, when the quiet of the house pressed in and I had nothing left to distract me from the size of what I'd done. But I also began, slowly, to notice things I hadn't noticed in years. The way morning light came through Alina's old kitchen window and landed across the counter in a long gold stripe. The particular silence of a house where no one was waiting for me to fail at something. My own hunger returning, not just for food, though that too, but for things, for reading again, for standing in the garden Alina had left overgrown and imagining what it might become, for humming while I worked instead of holding my breath. It was in that kitchen, almost by accident, that the bakery began. I had always loved baking, in the distant way you love things you haven't had time for in years, and one afternoon, restless and unable to sit still with my grief, I made bread simply because kneading dough gave my hands something to do that wasn't scrolling through old photographs or rereading Alina's letter for the 100th time. I gave a loaf to a neighbor who'd helped me carry boxes in. She asked, a week later, if I'd sell her another. Word moves quickly in small towns. Within a few months, I had a standing order from the little grocery down the road, and within a year, I had converted the front room of the house, the one with the best light, into a small shop. Nothing grand. A few tables, a case for pastries, the smell of cinnamon that Alina's walls seemed to have been waiting to release all along. I named it after her, in the end. It felt right. A small plaque by the door, her name in the same careful, slanted style I remembered from the letter, though of course I had to have someone else render it, since I couldn't replicate her handwriting myself. My son grew used to the smell of bread rising before dawn, used to helping me stir batter with a spoon too big for his hands, used to a mother who smiled, actually smiled, not the careful, managed expression I used to perform for him during those exhausted early months, but something unguarded and real. I think about that kitchen sometimes, the one I left, the dish towel, the laugh. I think about how certain he was that I had nowhere to go, how certain I was too, for a while, because certainty like that has a way of becoming truth if you're tired enough and alone enough and no one around you offers another possibility. I didn't find my way out through strength alone, though I'd like to claim that, and some days I do believe it a little. I found my way out because a woman I barely knew, who noticed a restlessness in me before I recognized it myself, decided that I deserved a place to feel safe, and left me the means to have one. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, or a house, or land, though I am grateful, endlessly, for all three. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is simply the courage to begin again, the proof, arriving exactly when you need it most, that somewhere always exists, even when someone you love insists otherwise. Would you have stayed?